3 weeks. That was how long the Ashworth Winter Ball had been the only event anyone of consequence in the county discussed, and the Ashworth Ballroom did nothing to disappoint them. The chandeliers held 400 candles between them, lit at precisely 7 o'clock by a team of footmen who moved with the synchronized patience of soldiers on maneuver. The women who arrived wore gowns of ivory silk and pomona green, and a particular shade of rose that had been fashionable in London the previous season and had now completed its migration to the provinces, slightly altered but no less aspirational. The men wore tailcoats pressed to a sharpness that cost their valets half a morning's labor. Every surface that could be polished had been polished. Every arrangement of hothouse flowers had been reviewed and revised. Lord Ashworth's estate ran to 32 rooms, and on the night of the winter ball, every one of them that could be entered by a guest was opened, warmed, and lit as proof of something. And at the edge of all that candle-lit ambition, seated at a small table near the doors to the outer corridor with a household ledger open across her knees, was Honora Vane. She was not supposed to have a ledger at a ball. She was aware of this. She had brought it anyway, because the florist's invoice had been left unreconciled since Tuesday, and the florist had presented himself at the kitchen entrance that afternoon, with an expression that suggested he would not be returning to present himself again without resolution. Honora had written the resolution in the ledger, balanced the column, and was now watching the ballroom with the composed attention of someone who has completed one task and is deciding whether the next requires immediate action or can wait until morning. She wore gray. She had worn gray to the last 2 gatherings and would likely wear gray to the next, because gray was practical, and she owned it outright, and the woman who managed the household accounts of Ashworth Park did not purchase new gowns on a frequency that would satisfy anyone observing her wardrobe. She was 26. She had been managing those accounts, and the creditor negotiations, and the tenant correspondence, and the staff scheduling, and roughly 40% of the estate's operational decisions for 4 years. Her name appeared in none of the documents she had written. Hugo Ashworth arrived at 7:30. He arrived the way some men arrived at places, without announcement, without display, but with the particular quality of stillness that made a room adjust itself around him. He was the elder son, recently returned from 6 months attending to the family's financial affairs in Edinburgh, and his coat was dark and his cravat was precisely tied, and he looked at the room with the expression of a man completing an obligation he understood to be necessary. His father met him near the entrance. His brother, Edmund, was already at the card tables. Hugo's eyes moved through the room with a methodical attention that missed very little, and when they reached the small table near the corridor doors, they paused for a fraction of a second on the woman in gray, with a ledger across her knees, before continuing on. Honora noticed the pause. She returned to her ledger. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She had come to Ashworth Park 4 years ago at the invitation, or more precisely, the instruction, of her father's cousin, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, who was Lord Ashworth's wife, and who had discovered, upon marrying into the estate, that the household required someone to manage it, and that she herself found the work tedious past bearing. The invitation had been phrased as a visit. It had become permanent, with no formal discussion, and no adjustment to the terms, because there were no terms. Honora was family. Family did not require compensation. Family simply helped. She had helped for 4 years. The first 6 months had been the steepest learning. The Ashworth estate ran to 4 tenant farms, a wool merchant arrangement that had been mismanaged for the better part of a decade, an outstanding debt to a London solicitor that no one had told Lord Ashworth about in writing, because no one had wanted to be the one to tell Lord Ashworth anything in writing, and a household staff of 14, whose quarterly wages were 2 months in arrears when Honora arrived. She had begun with the wages, because unpaid staff are inattentive staff, and inattentive staff produce the kind of household entropy that shows at the edges: dust in the corners, silver not quite fully polished, guests not quite fully comfortable. She had located the wages shortfall within a week. 3 consecutive quarterly payments had been recorded against the estate accounts but drawn from a line of credit that had not been renewed, meaning the creditor held the debt and the staff held nothing. She renegotiated the credit line. She cleared the arrears. She said nothing to Mrs. Ashworth about any of it, because Mrs. Ashworth did not want to hear about it and would have been frightened had she heard. And a frightened Mrs. Ashworth communicated her fright to Lord Ashworth, who communicated it to everyone at dinner in the form of complaints about the fish course. The wool merchant arrangement took longer. The previous manager of the estate had signed a supply agreement with a merchant in York that obligated Ashworth to deliver a fixed weight of fleece annually at a price that had been fair in 1801, but was, by 1815, roughly 14% below the current market rate. 14% across 4 years of production represented a sum that made Honora press one hand briefly against the wall of the estate office when she first calculated it. She had written to the merchant. She had written 3 times. On the 4th letter she had enclosed a copy of the original agreement with 3 clauses annotated in her careful hand, noting that the agreement's renewal provision had never been formally executed after the first 5-year term, which meant the estate was operating outside a binding contract and could, if it chose, establish new terms at current market rates. The merchant had replied within the week. The new agreement was signed at a rate that recovered £400 annually in margin that had simply been walking out the door. Lord Ashworth had never known the original agreement existed. He had thanked his solicitor, a Mr. Graves, for the improved arrangement, because Mr. Graves had been standing in the room when Lord Ashworth received the news and had not corrected the attribution. Honora had picked up her list and continued. This was the texture of 4 years. She woke early and worked late, and the house ran smoothly, and the accounts balanced, and the creditors were managed, and the tenant farmers received their correspondence, answered within a fortnight, and when anything went well, it was attributed to the estate's good fortune, or Lord Ashworth's sound management, or occasionally to Mr. Graves. When anything went poorly, it required Honora's immediate attention, which she provided without complaint, because the alternative, letting things go poorly, was not something she was prepared to do. She had inherited from her father a meticulous country solicitor who had died when she was 21. The conviction that work done carelessly was not actually done at all. He had also left her, upon his death, a house with a mortgage she could not service and no income to service it with. She had sold the house, paid the mortgage, and arrived at Ashworth Park with 1 trunk and the complete absence of anywhere else to be. She had not been going to become less than she was. That had been the decision, made quietly in the estate office on her first morning, before anyone else was awake. She had looked at the account books and she had seen what needed doing, and she had decided that the fact that no one was going to thank her for it was not a reason not to do it properly. The one moment she had nearly broken had come in the 2nd year, when Mrs. Ashworth had introduced her at a dinner as our little cousin who helps with the household. The word little had been the thing. Honora had been standing beside the conserved record of 2 years' operational decisions, any one of which had kept the estate from a difficulty that would have embarrassed everyone at that table. She had said nothing. She had refilled the wine glasses when the footman was slow, and she had returned to her room and sat at her writing table for a long time, and then she had opened the account books and kept working. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but neither was she under any illusion that the step aside would be asked of her. It would simply be assumed. There had been one person in all of those 4 years who had seen her at her work without looking immediately away. That was Edmund Ashworth, Hugo's younger brother, who was easy and sociable and occasionally came to the estate office to borrow her pen because he could never locate his own, and who had once looked over her shoulder at the annotated wool merchant agreement and said, in a tone of genuine surprise, "Did you do all of that?" She had said yes. He had said, "Honora, you are wasted here," and then borrowed her pen and left. She had not been sure afterward whether he had meant it as a compliment or a complaint. It was, she supposed, both. Hugo Ashworth had been to Edinburgh for 6 months managing the family's subsidiary holdings there, a task he had assumed after his father's health had made long travel inadvisable. He had left in June and returned in December to a house he had not visited in half a year, and he had, in the days before the ball, spent 3 evenings in the estate office reviewing the current state of the accounts. He had not known, before those 3 evenings, that the accounts were kept by anyone other than Mr. Graves. He had arrived on the first evening expecting Mr. Graves. He had found instead a set of books maintained with a precision that he had not encountered outside the offices of the Edinburgh banking house he had spent 6 months negotiating with. Not merely accurate, organized by a logic he could see immediately was faster to navigate than the previous system, cross-referenced at the margins in a hand that was not Mr. Graves's, annotated with the kind of operational notes that only someone who had actually negotiated creditors and drafted supply agreements would think to include. He had held the wool merchant file for longer than the rest. He had read the annotated clauses. He had read the letter from the York merchant. He had set the file down, and then he had picked it up again and read it once more. He had asked Mrs. Ashworth the following morning who maintained the estate accounts. Mrs. Ashworth had said, "Oh, Honora manages all of that, she's been such a help," and moved on to discussing the florist's invoice before Hugo could ask a follow-up question. He had spent the second evening with the books again. He had found the record of the wage arrears resolution from 4 years prior, the renegotiated credit line, the cleared payments, the notation in the margin that said simply, "Arrears cleared, all 14 staff, new credit terms attached." He had checked the attachment. The terms were better than anything Mr. Graves had produced in the same period. He had found the tenant correspondence files, which were answered with a consistency and a practical intelligence that suggested someone who understood farming seasons and not merely rent schedules. He had found, in the back of the household ledger, a private notation in that same careful hand. Disputed invoice, florist, December 12th. Hold pending verification of delivery count. Do not release payment until confirmed. He had gone to the ball on the 3rd evening, and he had looked for the woman in gray before he had fully admitted to himself that he was looking. Hugo Ashworth was 31 years old, and had spent the last 4 of those years in a particular kind of solitude that was not loneliness, but was not its opposite either. His mother had died 5 years ago, in December, in this house, of a fever that had arrived and concluded itself in 11 days, with the efficiency of something that had not intended to be stopped. He had been at the house for 2 of those 11 days. He had not been there for the end. This was the thing he carried, and he carried it with the controlled stillness of a man who had decided that carrying it quietly was the only form of carrying he could permit himself, and who had consequently spent 5 years attending obligations and managing accounts and returning to a house that had his mother's portrait in the upper corridor and his father's health declining in the east wing, and nothing in between that felt like continuity. He danced with Miss Fairweather at 8 o'clock, because Miss Fairweather was the daughter of the county's largest neighboring estate, and it had been understood since July that Hugo would dance with her at the first opportunity, as a gesture toward the arrangement their respective fathers had been discussing with increasing specificity. She was beautiful and confident and entirely certain of the outcome of the evening, and she danced with the ease of a woman who has never had cause to doubt that the room is arranged for her benefit. He guided her through the figures correctly and said the appropriate things, and returned her to her mother's side with the precise courtesy that the situation required. He did not ask her for a second dance. Instead, he crossed the room. He had told himself, walking toward the small table near the corridor doors, that he was going to ask about the florist's invoice. Honora looked up when he was still 4 feet away, which meant she had been aware of his approach before he was within speaking distance, which told him something about the quality of attention she maintained even when appearing to read a ledger. She was not beautiful in the way the ballroom expected beauty. She was composed in the way that a well-built bridge is composed, everything placed where it would bear the most load. She had dark eyes that assessed him with a directness that was unusual and not unpleasant. "The florist's invoice," he said. "Has been resolved," she said. "The delivery count was verified this afternoon. Payment was authorized at 3 o'clock. She paused, one beat. "The arrangement in the east corridor has a stem count discrepancy. 7 stems billed that were not delivered. I deducted accordingly." Hugo looked at her for a moment. "The annotated clauses in the wool merchant file," he said. "Those were yours." It was not a question. She answered it as the statement it was. "Yes." "The credit line renegotiation. The tenant correspondence schedule." "Yes." 4 years, he said. 4 years, she agreed, and there was nothing in her voice that invited pity or sought credit. It was simply the accurate number. He said, "I should like to go over the Edinburgh holdings with you tomorrow morning, if you are available. Mr. Graves's approach has not been producing results I can recommend continuing." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a sentence to be said and has stopped expecting it. "I am available at 8 o'clock, she said. He nodded. He returned to the ball. Miss Fairweather's mother observed from across the room that Hugo Ashworth had spent 7 minutes at the edge of the ballroom speaking to the gray woman with the ledger. She said nothing to her daughter about it yet, but she filed it carefully. The morning meetings became a pattern before either of them named it as one. Honora arrived at the estate office at 8 o'clock on the first morning, with the Edinburgh file she had already reviewed overnight, because she had returned from the ball and not slept for 2 hours, out of the specific interest she could not yet permit herself to call more than professional. Hugo arrived at 8:05 with the Edinburgh correspondence in a leather satchel, and the expression of a man who had also not entirely slept. He spread the Edinburgh documents across the table. She spread the relevant Ashworth records alongside them. They worked for 2 hours in near silence, broken only by the exchange of specific numbers, specific questions, specific answers. He found by 10 o'clock that she had already identified the problem he had spent 3 weeks in Edinburgh failing to solve: a subsidiary lease agreement that obligated the family to a maintenance schedule they did not have the staff to execute, which meant they were technically in breach on 4 counts and exposed to penalty claims they had never budgeted for. "Here," she said, turning 3 pages to a marked section. "The maintenance obligation in Clause 7 is standard language for a commercial lease, but unusual in an estate sublease. Whoever drafted it copied from a commercial template without adjusting the staffing assumption. The family's actual obligation, properly read, requires 6 staff at the Edinburgh property on a permanent basis. You have 2. Hugo read the clause. He read it again. "Can it be renegotiated?" "I have drafted a proposed amendment," she said, and produced a single closely written page from the back of the file. "It converts the staffing obligation to a quarterly inspection requirement, which is what the lessor actually needs to protect the property's condition. He gets certainty of maintenance oversight. The family is relieved of an obligation it cannot practically meet. He should accept it, provided it is presented before he becomes aware of the breach." Hugo took the page. He read it with the focused attention she had come to recognize in him, the same quality as in the ballroom, the measuring look, but now directed at paper rather than at her. He set the page down. "You drafted this last night." "This morning, between 6 and 7. He said nothing. He simply set the Edinburgh file on top of the draft amendment and began organizing the remaining documents with the methodical care of someone who has decided the morning was productive and is now filing accordingly. Honora found she needed to press one hand briefly against the edge of the table, which she did, and then she picked up her pen and continued. The mornings continued, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and then the following Monday, without either of them establishing it as a schedule. Edmund appeared at the office door on Wednesday morning, observed his brother and Honora working in concentrated silence across two tables pushed together under the window, and retreated without saying anything, which was unusual enough that Honora noticed. Edmund was not the retreating type. The institutional disapproval assembled itself without requiring a meeting to organize it. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth raised the matter with her husband after a dinner at which she had observed Hugo refill Honora's wine glass before anyone else at the table. Lord Ashworth, whose health had been declining in ways that made him both more dependent on the estate's smooth operation and more irritable about discussions of it, said he was sure Hugo was simply being courteous to a household member, and that Eleanor was making something from nothing. Mrs. Ashworth said she was not making something from nothing. She was simply noting that Hugo had danced with Miss Fairweather precisely once and spent the subsequent week in the estate office with Honora at 8 o'clock every morning. Lord Ashworth said that Hugo was attending to the Edinburgh matters. Mrs. Ashworth said that the Edinburgh matters must be very extensive indeed. Miss Fairweather herself came to call on Thursday, a visit that had been arranged 2 weeks prior but whose timing now carried a specific weight. She arrived in a carriage with her mother, wearing a morning dress of soft blue that had cost more than Honora's entire wardrobe, and she was gracious and composed and settled into the drawing room with the assurance of a woman who knows her position and expects it to be confirmed. When Honora entered with the tea tray, a task she performed because the housemaid was occupied with an upstairs emergency involving a burst pipe, and Honora had simply taken the tray herself rather than let the guests wait. Miss Fairweather looked at her with the pleasant, emptying expression that women of her position reserve for household staff who have exceeded their station by entering a room. "How kind," Miss Fairweather said, about the tea, to Honora, and yet not quite to her, slightly past her, at the room in general. "The milk is on the left," Honora said, "and there is a small chip in the sugar bowl that the serving spoon catches on if you apply it at the usual angle." She set the tray down, met Miss Fairweather's gaze with the direct equanimity of a woman who has resolved 4 years of crises before breakfast, and returned to the corridor. She heard from the corridor Miss Fairweather's mother say, in a low tone, "Who on earth is that?" She heard Mrs. Ashworth's reply, muffled but audible, "A cousin who helps with things." Honora straightened her spine and went back to the estate office. Mr. Graves, the family solicitor, arrived that same Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the Edinburgh lease amendment, which Hugo had sent to him for review 2 days prior. He arrived at 3 o'clock and was shown directly to the library, where Hugo had arranged to meet him. What Hugo had not arranged was for Honora to be present, but she was, because the Edinburgh file was on the library table, and she had been working from it all morning, and she was still there when Graves arrived. Graves was 64, experienced, and accustomed to being the most legally informed person in any room he entered at Ashworth Park. He reviewed the amendment draft for several minutes. He made several sounds that suggested careful consideration. Then he said, addressing Hugo, "The conversion of the staffing obligation to a quarterly inspection clause is sound in principle, but this language in subclause 3 will not hold up if the lessor's own solicitor examines it closely. The inspection frequency is undefined, which leaves the family exposed." "The inspection frequency is defined in the annex," Honora said, from the table. Graves looked at her. "The annex on page 2 of the amendment," she said, turning the relevant page to face him across the table. Quarterly inspections, defined as occurring within the first 10 days of January, April, July, and October, with written notification to the lessor's agent no fewer than 7 days in advance. The frequency is explicit. The form of notification is explicit. The family is not exposed. Graves read the annex. He read it again. He looked at Hugo. Where did this young woman qualify? Hugo said evenly, "She has been managing this estate's affairs for 4 years. She is not a solicitor." "The clause is sound regardless," Hugo said. "I would be glad to review your specific objection if you have one. But if the objection is to her having written it, that is a separate matter, and not one I intend to address." Graves set the amendment down. He said, to the room in general, the particular nothing that a man says when he has been precisely correct and cannot admit it. Then he said he would review the complete document and provide written feedback by Monday. He left. Hugo looked at Honora across the table. She said, "His objection about subclause 3 was not unreasonable. I should add a definition of written notification to cover the case of a lessor's agent who disputes the delivery method." Hugo said, "Add it." She picked up her pen. Edmund found her in the garden that evening, which was unusual, because it was December, and the garden was not comfortable in December, and Honora was there because she had needed air, and because the estate office felt, after the afternoon, like a room she had filled entirely and needed to step out of. She was standing near the bare rose beds with her coat pulled close, looking at the house. "Graves complained to my father," Edmund said, falling into step beside her in the way he had, without preamble, without negotiating the entry. "Father is concerned. Mother is more than concerned. Miss Fairweather's mother sent a note this afternoon that my mother is describing as pointed." "About what specifically?" "About Hugo spending every morning with you. About the ball. About the fact that he refilled your wine glass before Miss Fairweather's at dinner, which apparently has been widely remarked upon." He paused. "Also about you bringing the tea tray." "I brought it because the housemaid was occupied." "I know. That's the problem in a way, isn't it?" He looked at the house, too. "If you were nothing to Hugo, bringing the tea tray would be exactly what you are here for, and no one would remark on it. The fact that they remark on it suggests you are not nothing to him." Honora said, "I manage the estate accounts." Edmund said, Honora, gently, like a patient correction. She did not answer that. She looked at the house, at the lit windows of the library on the second floor, and then she turned back toward the kitchen entrance. She had managed harder things than this. She could manage this. It was 2 mornings later, on a Friday, when Hugo came to the estate office at 7:30, 30 minutes earlier than usual, and found her already at the table with the Edinburgh Amendment in its final form, the definition of written notification added, the annex renumbered, the entire document copied cleanly onto fresh paper. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the document, and then at her. "You have it crooked," she said, without looking up from the page she was reading. He paused. "Your cravat," she said. "It has been tilted to the left since Monday at least, possibly longer. I assumed you were aware of it." He reached up and found the tilt without a mirror. "You did not say anything. It was not my place to say anything. And now?" She looked up then and met his eyes, and something in the quality of her attention was different from the directness of the morning meetings, older and less defended, and more deliberately stated. "And now I have decided it is my place to say so." She returned to the page. "It wants 2 fingers' width to the right." He adjusted it. He came to the table and picked up the amended Edinburgh document and read through it in silence. When he finished, he set it down and said, "My mother kept the household accounts before she was ill. She had a system for the tenant correspondence that I was never able to reconstruct after she died. I found it last week, in the back of the 1808 ledger. It was exactly the system you use." Honora stopped writing. He said, not looking at her, looking at the Edinburgh document. She would have found you remarkable. She did not say anything immediately. She had not been spoken about in terms of remark for longer than she could calculate with any precision. She set her pen down, very carefully, and she said, "Thank you," in the tone of a woman who means the two words to carry the full weight of 4 years, and leaves it there. He looked at her then, not the measuring look of the ballroom, something more private than that, and more decided. He said, "There is a formal dinner at Ashworth on the 22nd. The Edinburgh Lesser's representative will attend, along with 2 members of the County Investment Committee who have interest in the subsidiary holdings. I should like you present at the dinner table, not as household staff, as the person who drafted the amendment." She said, "Your father will not approve of that." He said, "I am aware." She said, "Miss Fairweather's mother will be there." He said, "I am also aware." She considered this for one long moment, the way she considered everything, completely, without rushing to the end, and then she said, "I will need a dress that is not gray." His expression changed, slightly, in a direction she did not have an immediate name for. "I believe Edmund knows a dressmaker in the village," he said. Edmund did know a dressmaker. He also knew, it emerged, that Honora had not purchased a new dress in 2 years, and he expressed this knowledge with an indignation on her behalf that was so unguarded and so genuine that she found herself smiling in the carriage on the way to the village, which was not something she had done in a carriage for some time. Edmund sat across from her and said, "You are doing something extraordinary for this family, and you are being compensated with gray wool and a seat near the corridor door. And if Hugo does not—" He stopped himself. "Does not what?" she said. "Recognize it appropriately," he finished, carefully. She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been looked after, unexpectedly, and does not entirely know what to do with it. "You have always been kind to me," she said. "It has not been any effort," Edmund said simply. "You make it easy." The dressmaker produced in 4 days a gown of deep garnet that had cost Edmund more than he mentioned, and Honora more than she was entirely comfortable accepting. It was not fashionable in the way Miss Fairweather's dresses were fashionable. It was precisely made. It suited her in the way things suit people who have rarely had things made to suit them, with a faint quality of surprise, as though the right version of herself had been there all along and simply hadn't had the clothes for it yet. Lord Ashworth called Hugo to the study 3 days before the dinner. Honora did not know the content of that conversation. She knew it had happened because Hugo came to the estate office that afternoon with a quality of controlled quietness that was different from his usual containment, compressed rather than simply held. He sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "My father finds the dinner arrangement irregular." "Does he?" "He has concerns about the impression it creates." "What impression does it create?" Hugo looked at her. "He considers that there is an understood direction to my marital expectations, and that presenting you formally at the dinner table moves against that understanding." Honora set her pen down. She said, "I am not asking to be presented at the dinner table as anything other than the person who drafted the amendment that will save this family significant legal exposure. If your father finds that irregular, I cannot resolve his objection for him. I can only do my work." "He is not wrong that there is an understood direction," Hugo said. "I know he is not wrong," she said steadily. "I am not pretending otherwise." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I told him the amendment would not exist without you. I told him the wool merchant margin, the tenant correspondence system, the credit line renegotiation. None of it would exist without 4 years of work he has never formally acknowledged. He said that was a separate matter from the dinner. I said it was not a separate matter at all." She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. She said, "You defended that to him." "I stated it to him. Whether it constituted a defense depends on his position. She picked up her pen again. She did not look at him when she said, "He raised you to understand the estate. He raised you to protect it. The amendment protects it. That is the argument that will work on him, eventually, not the other argument." Hugo said, "What is the other argument?" She said, looking at the page in front of her. "The other argument is not one I am prepared to make for you. The dinner on the 22nd was not a private family gathering. 14 sat at the table. The Edinburgh Lesser's representative, a Mr. Aldred, came with his own solicitor. The two members of the County Investment Committee, Mr. Finch and Mr. Rowe, were men of 60 and 53 respectively, experienced and not easily impressed. Lord Ashworth presided from the head of the table, with the careful authority of a man who is less well than he appears. Mrs. Ashworth sat beside him. Miss Fairweather and her mother had been invited. Honora had seen their name on the seating arrangement and said nothing, and were placed midway along the right side. Hugo sat near the center. Honora was placed, at Hugo's specific arrangement, across from Mr. Aldred, which was either a courtesy or a statement, possibly both. The first two courses passed with the conversation that dinners of this kind produce: inquiries about the Edinburgh weather, observations about the wool market, a brief discussion of road conditions that served as a container for the general discomfort of people who did not yet know one another well enough to discuss what they actually intended to discuss. Mr. Finch, who was the more direct of the two committee members, waited until the third course to say, across the table to Hugo, "We have reviewed the amendment your solicitor transmitted last week. There is a question about the inspection obligations enforcement mechanism." Hugo said, "Miss Vane can address that directly. She drafted the amendment." The table adjusted, fractionally, the way a table adjusts when something has been said that falls slightly outside the expected form of things. Mr. Finch looked at Honora. She said, "The enforcement mechanism is in Clause 4 of the primary amendment body, cross-reference to the annex. If the family fails to conduct an inspection within the defined window, the lessor's remedy is a written notice of default with a 21-day cure period. The lessor cannot terminate on the basis of a single missed inspection. Termination requires 2 consecutive uncured defaults. The family has sufficient administrative capacity to ensure the notifications are calendared." She paused. "I can show you the clause directly if you have the document with you." Mr. Finch did have the document with him. He produced it from his coat. He turned to Clause 4. He read it. He looked at Mr. Rowe, who had also read it, and something passed between them that was not quite approval, but was in the neighborhood of it. Mr. Aldred's solicitor said from the other side of the table, "The annex language regarding the form of written notification. That was tightened from the draft version we reviewed initially." "Whose revision was that?" "Mine," Honora said. The solicitor said, "It is correct. We had the same concern about the original language." Miss Fairweather's mother, who had been observing this exchange with the expression of a woman watching something she did not invite and cannot stop, said, addressing the table in general, "How interesting that a household member should be so well acquainted with lease arrangements." It was said pleasantly, in the manner of compliments that are not compliments. Honora looked at her. "I have managed the Ashworth estate accounts for 4 years, she said. "The lease arrangements are part of those accounts. I am well acquainted with them because the family's financial stability depends on someone being so." The table was quiet for a beat. "Indeed," said Lord Ashworth from the head of the table. Honora looked at him. She had not expected that word from that direction. He did not look back at her. He addressed Mr. Finch. "The committee's position on the amendment, is it favorable?" Mr. Finch said that on balance it was, provided 2 minor clarifications were incorporated in the final version. He named them. Honora wrote them on the edge of the menu card beside her plate, because she did not have her notebook, and she would not forget them, but she preferred to have them written. Hugo, from across the table, watched her write. He had been watching her, she realized, for most of the dinner, not conspicuously, but consistently. Miss Fairweather, who was perceptive in the way that beautiful, confident women are perceptive, which is to say entirely when something threatens to move against their plans, watched Hugo watch Honora, and her expression did not change, but her spine straightened, and she said something charming to Mr. Rowe, and Mr. Rowe laughed, and she was, by every measurable standard of the room, the most socially accomplished woman at the table. And it made no difference at all. After dinner, when the men withdrew for port and the women remained in the drawing room, Mrs. Fairweather said, in the pleasant tone she had been using all evening, "Miss Vane, you must find it terribly difficult being so practical in a household setting. It cannot be what you had hoped for." Honora said, "I find it exactly what I have made it," and turned to accept a cup of tea from the housemaid, with the specific courtesy she always extended to the household staff. There was a silence in the drawing room that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained within it the adjustment of every woman present. Mrs. Ashworth, to her own visible surprise, said, "Honora has done remarkable work for us." She said it the way people say things they have known for a long time and have simply never organized into words before. Remarkable work. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Honora drank her tea and said nothing further. The County Investment Committee convened a formal hearing on the Edinburgh holdings 3 weeks later, because Mr. Finch and Mr. Rowe had returned to their colleagues with a summary of the dinner and a copy of the amendment, and the summary had produced questions that the full committee wished to address before advising Lord Ashworth on the subsidiary lease structure. This was not unusual procedure, Mr. Finch explained in a note to Hugo. It was simply due diligence. Hugo had told Honora about the hearing on a Monday morning in the estate office, with the Edinburgh file open between them and the 2 menu card clarifications already incorporated into the final document. She had looked at him and said, "They want to see the full accounting. They want to understand the estate's complete financial position relative to the subsidiary holdings." "Yes, I will prepare the presentation," he said. "It should be you who presents it." She looked at him. "I am not a solicitor. I am not a family member of standing. The committee will expect Lord Ashworth or Mr. Graves." "Mr. Graves," Hugo said, with a precision that named exactly what he thought of that option, "reviewed the amendment for a week and missed the annex. My father cannot travel to the committee chamber in his current health. I am prepared to present alongside you, but the accounting is yours, and the committee should hear it from the person who produced it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will need a week to prepare the full presentation." "You have 10 days, he said. She had 7. She worked in the estate office from 6 in the morning until 8 at night for 7 consecutive days, and the document that emerged was 43 pages. The complete history of the Ashworth estate accounts over 4 years, the Edinburgh subsidiary position, the amendment in final form, the wool merchant renegotiation, the wage arrears resolution, the tenant correspondence record, and a forward projection of the estate's income position under 3 scenarios: current terms, amended terms, and defaulted terms. Each section was cross-referenced. Each figure had a source annotation. The document was, in the language of the estate office, simply the accounts as they were. In the language of anyone who had not seen it before, it was the kind of document that took a room of experienced men slightly longer than expected to absorb. Edmund brought her dinner on 3 of those 7 evenings, setting the tray on the corner of the table without comment, and removing the previous evening's untouched cup. He said, "On the 5th evening, Hugo asked me to tell you he has written to Mr. Aldred, confirming the committee hearing date." She did not look up. "Tell him I have noted it." Edmund paused. "He also asked me to tell you that he considers what you are doing for this family irreplaceable." She stopped writing. Edmund said, "He used that word specifically. I thought you should hear it." She picked up her pen again. She was not going to cry in the estate office over the word irreplaceable. She was, however, going to remember exactly how Edmund had said it, and the specific quality of plainness with which Hugo had apparently deployed it, for a considerable time. "Tell him thank you," she said. The committee chamber was a long, paneled room in the county hall, with 4 members at the table and a row of chairs along the wall for observers. Mr. Finch and Mr. Rowe were present, along with 2 other committee members Honora had not met. Mr. Graves was there, in the observer chairs. Miss Fairweather's mother was not present. There was no official mechanism by which she could be, but her absence had the quality of a held breath. Lord Ashworth had come. Hugo had not expected it. Honora had not expected it. He arrived in a closed carriage with Edmund supporting his arm, and he seated himself in the observer row without explanation, and his presence in the room had the quality of a decision made deliberately and not discussed in advance. Hugo stood at the front of the chamber and introduced the estate's position in 4 sentences: the Edinburgh holdings, the subsidiary lease, the identified breach, the proposed resolution. He said, "The full accounting and the amendment documentation were produced by Miss Honora Vane, who has managed the Ashworth estate's accounts for 4 years. I would ask the committee to hear directly from her." He stepped to the side. Honora set the 43-page document on the committee table, 1 copy for each member, which she had produced by hand over the final 2 days, and she stood. The committee room did not erupt. There was a long moment in which the 4 men at the table looked at her, and then at the documents, and then Mr. Finch opened the first page. She began. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented. She moved through the Edinburgh lease structure, the identified breach, the financial exposure under defaulted terms, a figure that produced, she noted, a small adjustment in Mr. Rowe's expression, and the amendment's resolution of each exposed element. She presented the annex. She presented the menu card clarifications, now incorporated. She presented the forward projection under all 3 scenarios, with the figure differential between amended and defaulted terms made explicit and precise. Then she said, "I would also present, for the committee's awareness, the supporting account history, which documents the estate's current operational position and provides the context for understanding why the Edinburgh holdings matter to the overall financial structure." She moved without pause through 4 years of accounts: the wage arrears, the wool merchant, the credit line, the tenant correspondence productivity rate, which she had calculated as a ratio of response time to tenant complaint resolution, and which showed, in the 3rd year, a 22% improvement over the system it had replaced. She did not tell the committee she was responsible for these results. She presented the results, because results present themselves, and the source is visible to anyone paying attention. Mr. Finch said, partway through the wool merchant section, "The annotated clause here, this identified the contract renewal gap?" "Yes," she said. "And the renegotiated rate?" "Yes." He looked at the figure. He looked at the 4-year cumulative margin recovery. He said to no one in particular, 400 annually. "Over 4 years, that is £1,600 in margin recovered," she said. That was previously walking out the door. The chamber was quiet for a moment after that. Mr. Rowe said, "Miss Vane, how did you identify the contract renewal gap?" "The original agreement was in the estate archive," she said. "I read it. The renewal clause was on page 3. Mr. Rowe looked at his colleague. Something moved between them, in the way of experienced men who are recognizing something they did not expect. The presentation continued for 1 hour and 40 minutes. At the end of it, Honora set her pen down and stood with her hands quiet at her sides and waited. Mr. Finch said, "We will require a brief withdrawal to consider." The committee withdrew. Honora returned to the observer chairs and sat beside Edmund, who said nothing but put his hand briefly over hers in the way of a person who does not have adequate words and has decided touch is more honest. Hugo was standing at the side of the room. He looked at her from across the space, and in his expression she saw the particular thing she had been waiting, without knowing it, to see in someone's face for 4 years. The clear, specific acknowledgement of what she was, not admiration of her dress, or her manner, or her situation, acknowledgement of what she had actually done. She looked back at him until she felt something shift in her chest, like a weight that had been there so long she had stopped naming it as weight. The committee returned in 14 minutes. Mr. Finch said the committee found the amendment sound and recommended its execution without further revision. He said the committee further noted that the estate's financial management appeared to be maintained at a standard that exceeded the committee's ordinary expectations for holdings of this size, and that they would be recommending to their colleagues that the Ashworth records be reviewed as a possible model for guidance to other estates in the county. He said, looking directly at Honora, "The committee extends its acknowledgement to the person responsible for that standard." Mr. Graves, in the observer chairs, said nothing. He looked at the floor, and then, after a moment, he looked at Honora with the expression of a man who has arrived, slowly and without pleasure, at a conclusion he cannot any longer avoid, and he gave a single nod. It was not warmth. It was not apology. It was the particular acknowledgement of a man who has been professionally precise his entire life, and cannot, when presented with precision, entirely fail to recognize it. Lord Ashworth from his chair said, "My father would have said, find someone who understands what a thing is worth and hold on to them." He said it to the room, not to Honora specifically, but he said it. Edmund pressed her hand briefly and released it. Hugo crossed the chamber. He crossed it in the full sight of Mr. Finch and Mr. Rowe and the other 2 committee members and Mr. Graves and Lord Ashworth and Edmund, and he stood before Honora, and he took her hand, her bare right hand, because she had removed her gloves to write during the presentation, and he kissed it. Not as a social form, as a statement. The chamber understood it before anyone in it found language for it. Lord Ashworth looked at his elder son. He looked at Honora. He said nothing, but he looked, and the quality of his looking was different from anything it had been before. Slower, more complete, less certain of its own previous conclusions. Miss Fairweather received the news through her mother's note, which arrived the same evening. She read it in her morning room. She did not weep. She was not the weeping sort. She said, with a composure that was its own form of dignity, that she hoped Miss Vane was well suited to estate management in all its forms. She then wrote a note to a cousin in Bath and arranged a visit for January, and she did not speak of Hugo Ashworth again in any room her mother was present in. She was not destroyed. She was simply made irrelevant by a set of facts she had not been given the opportunity to account for. It was not a punishment. It was the mathematics of a situation that had never been as certain as she believed. Hugo asked to speak with Honora privately on the evening after the hearing. She met him in the library, because the library was the room they had worked in least, and it felt, for that reason, like less occupied ground. He said, "I owe you a more complete conversation than I have had the correct occasion to have." She said, "You do not owe me anything. The estate." "Not about the estate," he said. "About the fact that I intend to ask Lord Ashworth's permission to propose to you, and that I wished to tell you so before I did, because you are not the kind of person who should learn of it second." She was quiet for a longer moment than usual. She said, "Hugo," he said, "I know the objections. I have considered them more than you likely realize. I know what my father expects. I know what the county expects. I know what Miss Fairweather and her mother expected 4 weeks ago, and what they expect now." He paused. "None of those things are what I expect. None of them are what I have been sitting with in the estate office at 8 o'clock in the morning for the past month, she said. You spoke of your mother's correspondence system. He said, yes. That was not nothing, she said. I want you to know I understood it was not nothing. It was not nothing, he agreed. She pressed one hand briefly against the shelf behind her. Then she said, ask your father, and then ask me. He asked Lord Ashworth the following morning, the conversation which Honora was not present for, and which Edmund declined to summarize except to say that it had been exactly as long as it needed to be, and not 1 minute longer, produced permission. It produced permission with the specific reluctance of a man who has been looking at the same horizon for 20 years and has suddenly found someone standing in front of it and can no longer be entirely certain the horizon was what he thought it was. Lord Ashworth came to the estate office the day after. Honora was at the table with the morning correspondence. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up and he said, I want to say something to you. She set her pen down. I should have said it 3 years ago, he said, or possibly 4. My wife has been telling me, in her way, for some time. The committee was more direct. He paused. You have kept this estate. I did not know that, entirely, until I sat in that chamber and watched you put 43 pages of it on a table and explain to 4 experienced men exactly what they were looking at. He was quiet for a moment. My mother kept accounts, he said. It came out differently than he appeared to have planned it. She used to say that the person who reads the accounts reads the real life of a house. Honora said carefully. She was right. He said, Hugo is a good man. He has been, since his mother died, a man in a house that has not felt like his. I think that may change. He did not look at her when he said the next part. I think you may have something to do with that. She said, I hope so. He nodded once, with the particular formality of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to arrive and is handling it with what dignity he has available. Then he turned and went back to the east wing, and Honora sat alone in the estate office for a full minute before she picked up her pen. Hugo came to the estate office at 7:45 the next morning, which was early even for him, and Honora was already there, because she was always already there, and he set nothing on the table. He stood and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he said, not because it is expedient, or because the county hearing produced a public moment that required some public response, or because the committee's acknowledgement made the arrangement less irregular than it might otherwise appear, but because you read 3 pages into an old contract and identified a clause that everyone else had read past for 14 years, because you arrived at 8 o'clock every morning and worked and made no complaint and asked for nothing, because when I sit in the estate office, it is the first place in this house that has felt like a place where the actual life of the house is happening, and that is because you are in it. He paused. Will you marry me? She thought about it. This was not uncertainty. It was the way she thought about everything, completely, turning it in all directions and making sure she had seen every face of it before she answered. She had been managing crises before breakfast for 4 years. She had balanced accounts and negotiated creditors and drafted clauses and done it all invisibly and without complaint, and she had not become less than she was, and she was not going to answer quickly simply because the answer was clear. She said yes. He took her hand. It was a bare hand, because she had been writing, and he held it for a moment, and then she straightened his cravat with her free hand, which wanted 2 fingers' width to the right again, and he let her, and then neither of them said anything for a while. They were married in March. The church in the village held 40 people and was full. Edmund stood beside Hugo with an expression of unconcealed satisfaction. The 3 women from the household staff who had been Honora's first genuine welcome at Ashworth Park, Mrs. Purdy, the housekeeper, Nell, the lady's maid, and Scott, the head groom's wife, who had once brought her tea without being asked in the middle of a creditor emergency, sat in the second row and were, collectively, the most visibly pleased people in the church. Lord Ashworth attended and sat in the front row, and was seen by at least 4 people to close his eyes for a moment during the vows. The life they built was not spectacular in any way that a ballroom would recognize. It was made of mornings in the estate office and evenings in the library. Hugo brought a problem. Honora had usually already identified it. She brought a document. He had usually already read half of it and was waiting for her to explain the other half. They argued about the Edinburgh tenant terms for 3 weeks in September and resolved it, eventually, by writing 3 versions of the proposed amendment and testing each one against the lessor's probable objections until one held. Honora won the argument. Hugo conceded without being asked to concede, which she found, over time, to be one of his more remarkable qualities. Their daughter was born 14 months after the wedding. They named her Eleanor, which was Hugo's mother's name, and also, by coincidence, that was not entirely coincidence, the first name of the patron saint of the parish church. Eleanor arrived in the world with her father's stillness and her mother's eyes, and an opinion about schedules that she expressed at volume from the first morning. Honora nursed her in the estate office 3 days after the birth, because there was a tenant correspondence that needed addressing, and she had found that both things could be done simultaneously, and that Eleanor did not appear to mind. The annotated account system that Honora had developed over 4 years at Ashworth Park was copied, at the investment committee's recommendation, and distributed to 7 neighboring estates in the county. The distribution was credited to the committee in the covering letter. This was not corrected in any official document. It was, however, corrected in the letter that Mr. Finch wrote privately to Hugo, which he wrote without being asked, and in which he said, plainly, that the system was Miss Vane's, or Mrs. Ashworth's, as she now was, and that the committee considered it a significant contribution to the county's estate management practice, and that they wished her to know they knew it. Honora read the letter and filed it in the back of the 1817 ledger, next to the copy of the wool merchant renegotiation, which she had also filed there. She had, by then, 2 children and 4 years of marriage and 47 years of life remaining, which she spent with the same methodical care she had spent on everything she had ever put her hands to. Hugo stood in the doorway of the estate office one evening in the spring of that year, watching her work. Eleanor was asleep in the nursery. The house was quiet. She was writing in the margin of the correspondence file in her careful hand, the annotation precise and small, and entirely legible at any scale. She did not look up, but she knew he was watching. She had always known when he was watching. She picked up her pen. She returned to her list. She had always been this person. The world had simply, for a time, failed to look,